Surprise! How we doing? Good to see you.
Oh, hi, honey. How are you? Good.
Good to see you, sweetheart.
Thank you. Nice to see you. What kind of airplane do you usually fly?
Usually a 172, although the last time I was flying in a Cherokee, so it doesn't really matter. I'm used to it. Piper from the days of all my 3 Comanches.
Yeah, you're the Comanche girl, I remember.
Yeah, low-wing Comanches.
I've been very lucky, and I've been able to fly some Stearmans about once a month.
Oh, good.
And
That's great.
That's the airplane that I owned when I was 20 years old out in California. Very curious kid. My first ride in an airplane was at 9 years of age. And it was wonderful. The freedom, the smell of the exhaust, the air going over my hair.
It was the thrill of going up and being free up there. And you'd look down and you could get a proper perspective. I always was very positive about always wanting to learn something new and have a new adventure.
My first experience of flight was when I was very young. Becoming a bit alarmed because in my mind these clouds are solid and we're going to crash into them and my mother is going to kill us. As we get closer and closer, I say, why are we going so close to the clouds? We're going to hit them. And she truly laughed and said, you know, watch this. And away we went through and over the clouds.
Always a certain amount of prejudice about women getting into the men's fields. But there were stories of women making breakthroughs in aviation. So I knew it was possible.
She's out to break the women's speed record. Jacqueline Cochran. Take off at Detroit for the girl who now ranks as First Lady of the Sky. Women are progressing rapidly. The women's record, made by a ladybird of France, was 276 miles an hour. Jacqueline flies 17 miles an hour faster than that. She lands, and I wonder how she looks after flying more than 293 miles an hour. That's fast enough to disarrange one's hair. Sure enough.
No, I never met Jackie Cochran, but I can tell you a Jackie Cochran story. I was flying into Cincinnati, and the tower gave me landing instructions, and then I heard a woman's voice. She was flying a Lockheed Lodestar, and I thought, my word, what female pilot flies that big old Lockheed? The tower called her, and they said, Lockheed, you are lined up on the wrong runway. And she said, I'll land on any goddamn runway I please. And of course I thought, wow, I didn't know you could say that on the radio.
We didn't really need a reason to invite Jacqueline Cochran to the program. Our guest is probably the most distinguished woman pilot in the world today. It seems that you soloed at Roosevelt Field back in 1932.
That is correct, and
Came in for a dead stick landing.
right, and it was 48 hours after I'd seen my first airplane on the ground.
How many hours of instruction had you had when you soloed?
5 hours and 5 minutes.
But you've also done very well in the cosmetics business.
I did very well.
Of course, it helped to be married to a millionaire, you admit that.
Well, I was doing pretty well before I got married.
Jacqueline Cochran was an extraordinary gal. She was raised in poverty in the South. She had formed her own company. She met Floyd Odlum, who was, prior to the war, he was the highest paid CEO in the United States.
Jackie was very much of an individualist. First woman to do this, first woman to do that. And Jackie wanted to be a trailblazer.
Women with Wings. At Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas, famous flyer Jacqueline Cochran gives her ferry pilot students a last-minute inspection. Then it's off by plane for graduation ceremonies. Goodbye, daughter. I'm working for the Army now.
Jackie Cochran headed up the WASP program during World War II. The Women's Air Force service pilots who flew all the airplanes. That was the first time that happened. They flew all the military airplanes, but they didn't go to war.
What they did is that they provided ferrying capability. They would pick up the aircraft from the factories and fly them to a point where they would be turned over. And these women flew these planes with the same training or less that the men had, and had the same safety record. So they proved they could fly those aircraft.
Nobody should ever tell a WASP that flying's not a woman's job. They wouldn't believe it any more than if it were said a girl can't be a good flyer and a woman at the same time.
After the war, they didn't want to give that up. They wouldn't want to give up their independence. A lot of them stayed in aviation, and a lot of them didn't want to go back to the kitchen. They wanted their freedom again. And these WASPs really were great mentors. They organized these air races called the Powder Puff Derby. The first one I flew in was 52. You know, when you're 18, you don't have fear, and you don't think of it as being brave. You think of adventures and having fun, because 18-year-olds think nothing will ever happen to them.
And those air races are wonderful, and they're very inspiring, and you make lifelong friends.
What a thrill it is to have won this 13th annual All-Woman International Air Race. Mary and I feel very proud of this. We're real happy to be in Florida. What a wonderful state you have.
The air racing was very important. It proved the mettle. It proved that these gals knew what they were doing. The racing fraternity was very strong. The bond was very strong.
On October 4th, 1957, a world-stirring event took place.
Sputnik, my word, to see this thing going around the world.
Space was very, very exciting then. Everybody was into this space business.
I do remember Mother's extraordinary enthusiasm when she knew that the Sputnik was going to be traversing in the sky. She got us all out of the house and looking up at the sky and just, she had grapefruit juice in her hand and she poured it all over herself. She was just so excited.
How quickly it went from just sending up Sputniks and then sending up animals. I think everybody was astounded at those accomplishments.
I remember the Russians had, at that point in time, had succeeded in every single endeavor. They were ahead of us. The United States needed to catch up.
One of these 7 young men will be the first American into space. These are the astronauts. United States Project Mercury.
When this program started, a lot of the military guys wanted in it. So they developed a criteria for qualification to be an astronaut.
Each must be a graduate of a Navy or Air Force test pilot school, 1,500 hours of flight time, qualified in jet aircraft, an engineering background, and 5 feet 11 or less. 32 candidates reported to the Lovelace Clinic in Albuquerque, New Mexico for an exhaustive series of physical examinations. These tests were divided between those given under normal clinical procedures and a series used for the first time in Project Mercury.
NASA had picked Dr. Lovelace to set the standards for the astronauts in the program. So he had developed the testing and he had conducted the testing.
The question is Dr. Lovelace's work done?
We hope to continue to participate in the program. I might say that all our doctors and technicians are a little tired right at the moment.
My father was Dr. William Randolph Lovelace II. He had a great smile, but he could also be very serious. He was a surgeon first and foremost, but was always involved with aviation, then aerospace medicine. He was invited to be head of space medicine for NASA. That was a fun time because the 7 astronauts came to our house for dinner almost every night. And we were instructed to make conversation with everyone, so we did, and ate with them, voted on them each night in terms of who we liked the best, and would tell our father in the morning at breakfast. It was always Scott Carpenter. It was just an amazing time. They'd make fun of my father and the tests that he made them do, but there was obviously respect there.
I think the tests out at Dr. Lovelace's place at Albuquerque out there, certainly some of the tests we had out there were the most trying. And it's rather difficult to pick one because if you figure how many openings there are on the human body and how far you can go in any one of them.
You gave it away.
Now you answer which one would be the toughest for you.
The cookie cutter males. And cookie cutter means there was no difference in their religion, in their state of origin, or anything. They were just all exactly the same.
My father felt very strongly about having a group of women astronauts. If you're a pioneer, you just start with your instincts, I guess.
He felt that women had a definite role in space, that there were physically and emotionally that they had some attributes that were stronger than the male astronauts.
And he wanted to test their capability by comparing their test results to the test results of the male astronauts. Clearly, one of the women in his life that catapulted that into action was his relationship with Jackie Cochran.
I'm Jacqueline Cochran, and I really would like to be the first woman in space. Anyone who's spent as much time in the air as I have in the last 34 years is bound to yearn to go a little bit farther.
Jackie Cochran was my godmother, and Floyd Odlum actually was on our board of directors. I think he was the president. He was the original chairman of our board for the Lovelace Clinic. So he turned to Floyd Odlum and Jackie, and they financed that study.
This was his program. Dr. Lovelace did it on his own, outside of his contract with NASA, and invited 25 women to come and take the physical exam, very similar to what the astronauts were taking.
They had a list of the top pilots that they knew, and one of the first that was called was Jerry Cobb. She was a great gal.
I was asked by Dr. Lovelace and General Flickinger to be the first woman to go through these astronaut tests. This was in 1959, and both of them had just come back from a scientific meeting in Moscow. At that time, they had heard that the Russians were going to train women cosmonauts, and this was over 3 years ago. So they asked me, they thought we ought to get together and start doing something. They asked me if I would be the first woman then to go the astronaut test, which I couldn't say yes fast enough. And
now, I knew Jerry because she flew the Aero Commander. She had done a lot of flying. She flew a lot into South America, and I knew her life.
I knew Jerry Cobb. Yeah, she was a good pilot, but I think I could fly as well as she could. She may not think so, but I think I could have.
Why, in the Western program, do you think there is a need, if you feel there is a need, for women in space?
well, it's the same thing as is there a need for men in space? I mean, if we're going to send a human being into space, we should send the one most qualified. And in certain areas, women have a lot to offer, and other areas men do. I think that we ought to use both.
Jerry and I were from Oklahoma. I was at Fort Sill. She called and said, "Do you want to be an astronaut?" I said, "Absolutely."
I knew Wally, and Wally took me aside one time when we were having a competition, and she said, "I'm in a secret program. It's an astronaut program, and it's very secret." And I thought, that sounds like fun. I think I want to get involved in that. So here's my letter to Dr. Lovelace saying, "I'm physically fit, and I'm a pilot, and I'd like to participate in your tests." And here's his letter back. And he encloses a card which outlines the qualifications of the women astronauts. First thing they ask you is, what are your total flying hours? I can tell them that. Then they want to know your total jet hours, your aircraft flown hours in each, balloon flights, parachute jumps, hours flown over 20,000 feet, hours flown over 30,000 feet, hours flown over 40,000 feet, low pressure chamber indoctrination, explosive decompression experience, partial pressure suit experience. I could answer number one. Yeah, none of us had any qualification.
We
and
were
if she was
subjects.
an engineer.
We were subjects to be tested.
B was on that list. This was something that fit so much what she was. I mean, she was one of the finest professional pilots in the country, bar none, men or women.
They contacted me, and I guess they knew I was flying, and so they talked to me about it.
I was on a tour of Europe, and there were kind of rumors in the background of what was going on and how names had been asked for. And the next thing I knew, I got a phone call.
I went to my boss and I said, "I've been invited to go take an astronaut physical exam." My boss said, "We cannot spare you." So I quit my job to go take these tests.
I was the youngest, second one to go through after Jerry, maybe the third. In February of '61. There were 3 phases of astronaut testing. Phase 1 was at Lovelace Clinic in Albuquerque. My parents drove me there and had to sign me in.
We went through either singly or in pairs, and I went through with Janie Hart, who was a marvelous person.
Janie Hart, you know, you weren't supposed to have children, and Janie Hart had 8.
They were so curious about her that they invited her in. So she and I went through it together. We were the last 2 to go together.
It took 5 days, and they were quite incredible because they didn't really know what to think our bodies would do in the outer atmospheres, or how we were going to react.
The testing was arduous. It was thorough and long hours.
It was a little bit more thorough than most physical examinations.
You'd run from one test to the next test.
We had pulmonary function tests.
Some of them were not real friendly to the body.
Total body determination tests.
Some of them were kind of exotic.
Every tooth was taken pictures.
Some of them were kind of strange.
Every bone in my body had an x-ray.
They x-rayed and x-rayed and x-rayed.
They gave me 2 cups, and one said urine and one said stool.
I was having fun. I just kind of laughed at some of the stuff.
I said, I don't know what stool is. A stool to me is when I was sitting on a stool milking cows in Taos. I don't know what you mean. Oh, a stool is when you go to the bathroom. I said, you don't want that, do you?
I'll tell you very confidentially, don't tell anybody this. We had an enema every morning.
I said, wow.
There were some really oddball things like that.
They inject water, 10-degree water into my ears, and that's when your body just does not function. You have no control over your body.
Oh, yeah, I don't remember that. Yeah, I didn't like it, but I did it.
What they were doing to those gals was just ugly.
Really, none of the tests stood out that much. Shortly after I left, Jacqueline Cochran was coming in for an interview, too. And she had taken some tests, and he was going to give her the results of the tests, he told me. And I believe he told me she's not going to be happy with this.
So she found that she wasn't going to be able to be a part of the program. I think that was kind of a downer for her.
She was too old, I think, at that point to even be considered for space flight. Those aren't the issues to her.
Would you like to be a Mercury astronaut or astronaut?
I would like very, very much to be. But I don't think age has anything to do with it as long as you're healthy and vigorous, and I'm all of that. In fact, Dad, I got through yesterday. You know what I did?
No, what did
Without
you do?
played 18 holes of golf. Then cooked dinner.
The very last day they told me I had passed, and that meant a great deal to me.
It was very nice when some of the doctors said that I had done very well on these tests.
Remarkably, after having 9 full pregnancies, she just had a body that wouldn't quit. It was great.
And of the 23-ish girls that were taken, only 13 passed.
Later, when Bee sat down with Randy Lovelace, he was absolutely thrilled at what the women so far had done.
I was following it. Of course, I was following what the Russians were doing.
When Yuri Gagarin went up, just a phenomenal thing to happen. That was a huge event. All of us were conscious of it. All of us were conscious of the competition with Russia, the Soviet Union, at the same time. So there was the space race as well as just the scientific adventure of it.
My memories are, why can't the Americans do it? This was the feeling at the time.
The Russians were basically crowing, and they were clearly in advance of our space program. Our Mercury men were being prepared basically to compete.
All right, lift off and the clock is started. Yes, sir, reading you loud and clear. This is Freedom 7. The fuel is go.
They were strapped into a seat and sent up there, brought back down, and whoopee, here I am. I made it, but I didn't fly it.
Phase 2 was at Oklahoma City, and I stayed at Jerry's house, and that was the psychological tests.
I heard about a test where you were submerged in a tank of water and for a long period of time lost all the normal 5 senses.
That was a very interesting experiment where they isolate you in a tank of warm water.
The tank was in a great big room. They had already put the earplugs in my ears, And I had just enough foam rubber to go under the small of my back, and I was to lay on the water as long as possible. So I get in the water, and I get comfortable, and I spread eagle out. There's something wrong here. I splashed the water, couldn't feel it. Splashed my face, couldn't feel any water. Couldn't feel anything.
She found...
Regret to advise arrangements at Pensacola canceled. Probably will not be possible to carry out this part of the program. You may return expense advance allotment to Lovelace Foundation. Here's another one. Ms. Cobb has just informed us from Washington that she has been unable to reverse the decision postponing the Florida testing. I'm very sorry for such short notice, but it is unavoidable.
When he had the results, which he thought were superior to the men, so he did tell us that, and we all thought that was really cool, he took the results to Washington.
They said, hey, we have no need for women astronauts. Forget it.
There was certainly no great desire on the part of NASA. In fact, I'm confident that they were surprised, terribly surprised by the fact that the women succeeded as they did.
They did not want this program, pure and simple. That it had to be the biggest slap in the face he'd ever had. I mean, it had to be pretty devastating.
It was very heartbreaking for me because I wanted to go on and pursue this. But we kept getting letters from Jerry Cobb. Keep up your hopes. Keep up your aviation. Maybe we can get the program reinstated and go on. Shortly after, I was at an airport where there was a lot of helicopter training. I just decided, I think I'll learn how to do that too. All the men were jealous of this woman flying a helicopter, and they park it real close to the hangar. And I was a little afraid to take it up and over into a hover. But I kind of put it out of my mind. I didn't care. I was going to keep on fighting.
Well, I was disappointed, but about that time I decided that I would like to move out of flight instructing and go into a different kind of flying. So off I went to work for Beech Aircraft Corporation. And they were getting ready to introduce a new model airplane named the Musketeer. There were only 2 women in the United States flying for aircraft manufacturers, and one of them was Jerry Cobb, who was flying for Air Commander. The other one was Joyce Case, who was flying for Beech Aircraft. They were getting ready to introduce a Musketeer. They were going to fly 3 of them in all 48 contiguous states for 90 days, introducing the airplane. And of course, if 2 of the 3 pilots are female, we'll get a lot of free publicity. And I can tell you that we always flew in a dress and high heels. We were working hard. We were flying. We got used to flying in formation. We knew nothing about flying formation when we started out. But after a few days of it, we got pretty good at it. We made some 80 changes in that airplane the first year. So we were test pilots, no question about that.
was hired right after the test to go to California and be with Center Aviation. I bought my Stearman and I taught myself acrobatics. I love it when I can go flying. I love it when I can do acrobatics. It is fabulous because you are free. You're not attached to the gravity of the earth. You can do what you want to do. And that's how I feel, and that's how I think. Freedom. How am I going to get up there? I have to imagine. I'm not a jet. I am not a person. I'm a spirit going up.
Roger. Good Lord, right all the way. You've got speed, John Glenn.
Glenn was the first to orbit, first American.
Roger, keep is go and I am go. Our capsule is in good shape.
And let's face it, you're going up there in an untested system. Nobody really knows what's going to happen.
Roger, 0G, and I feel fine. Capsule is turning around. Oh, that view is tremendous.
So I give Glenn credit for courage. I give them all credit for courage.
Friendship 7, this is Gate to hearing. This is Friendship 7, a real fireball outside.
At the same time, I give the women the same credit for the same courage. Their willingness to take part in the unknown was equally strong and as courageous as that of the men.
About that time, Jerry had contacted the women and said, okay, let's make noise because they've cheated us by not letting us go to Pensacola and take more testing. So the secret is out.
Jerry Cobb and Janie Hart figured they would go up before the Senate committee and they would get the program reinstated because Janie Hart had political clout.
My father was elected to the Senate after having been the lieutenant governor of Michigan.
Janie and Jerry Cobb felt that Congress ought to tell NASA, now let's get with this, and let's do this.
Both Miss Cobb and Mrs. Hart. If everyone is agreeable, we will begin the questioning.
Janie started with an opening statement. I strongly believe women should have a role in space research. In fact, it's inconceivable to me that the world of outer space should be restricted to men only, like some sort of stag club. 100 years ago, it was quite inconceivable that women should serve as hospital attendants. Their essentially frail and emotional structure would never stand the horrors of a military dressing station. Finally, it was agreed to allow some women to try it, provided they were middle-aged and ugly. Ugly women presumably having more strength of character. I submit, Mr. Chairman, that a woman in space today is no more preposterous than a woman in a field hospital 100 years ago.
Mrs. Hart, you're the mother of 8 children. Do you think it would be difficult for a woman astronaut to also have a family?
In which order?
I'm asking you that. Which order?
Well, I've accomplished the production of 8 children and in the process of raising them, and I've still been able to acquire 2,000 hours of flying time and considerable aeronautical experience, and also to help my husband in his campaigns and so forth. So this indicates that I've been able to make constructive use of my time outside of having the children, and I don't think that the family life has been sacrificed one bit. Really, you should properly ask the children this and see how they feel about it.
For her, if she can have 8 kids in 10 years and make it work, the idea of going to space, I think, was not that great a challenge.
They once asked her, why would you want to go to the moon? This was in the paper. And she said, with 8 kids, you'd want to go to the moon too. All right, Ms. Cobb, do you have a prepared statement? Ms. Cobb, yes.
We, women pilots who want to be a part of space exploration, are not trying to join a battle of the sexes. We seek only a place in our nation's space future without discrimination. We ask as citizens of the nation to be allowed to participate with seriousness and sincerity in the making of history now as women have done in the past. No nation has yet sent a female into space. We offer you 13 women pilot volunteers.
Miss Cobb, do you think women are being discriminated against in the space program?
I don't think necessarily they're being discriminated against. I think that the rules have been established to where it makes it impossible for women to meet the qualifications of astronauts.
The most hyped up qualifying catch-22, of course, was that all of them were test pilots and jet certified pilots and fighter pilots in most cases. So they had that qualification that no women had. But of course, they couldn't because they weren't allowed to become jet fighter pilots.
There was a law. Eisenhower had put a law in that for women to fly military aircraft, they had to be men.
I don't think they should become astronauts because men are more mature than women.
I think they should. I think that women should have an equal right with men, and if they would qualify and like to go, they should be trained and sent.
Yes, I do, because they're lighter and smaller. I just think they ought to be.
And what about your opinion?
No, I disagree. I think that I don't think women are physically fit to be astronauts.
I certainly do think women should be astronauts. If they're physically fit, mentally alert, they're not any different than men on that. In fact, there are less women going to psychiatrists than men, so that gives you some idea as to their mental capabilities.
The people who held the hearing, they were in such awe of the astronauts who came and spoke and testified.
Scott Carpenter and John Glenn gave their point of view.
John Glenn was the hero. He was God, space God.
Oh, John Glenn, yes. Not one of our family's favorite characters, certainly not Mother's.
John Glenn made his statement. It's just a fact. The men go off and fight the wars and fly the airplanes and come back and help design and build and test them. The fact the women are not in this field is a fact of our social order.
He said that if the women can prove they're better than the men, then we'll welcome them with open arms to the cheers of the multitude. Yeah, right.
But if you could find women better qualified than yourself, how would you welcome them in the program? They would be very welcome.
Can you imagine a woman flying a jet or flying a dangerous aircraft? Oh, goodness gracious, no. But Jacqueline Cochran had flown the jets. She'd shattered all kinds of records. She had access to the jets because her husband, Floyd Odlum, was building the jets now for the Air Force. So she proved that the women could fly the jets. When it finally came down to the hearing, the congressional hearing, she testified.
Of course, Floyd Odlum and Jackie Cochran were large supporters of the Lovelace Foundation, so I didn't give up hope.
This is great. Oh, boy. All right, so I'm reading from the testimony of Jacqueline Cochran. The manned space flights are extremely expensive and also urgent in the national interest, and therefore in selecting astronauts, it was natural and proper to sift them from the group of male pilots who had already proven by aircraft testing and high-speed precision flying that they were experienced, competent, and qualified to meet possible emergencies in a new environment. From all I have been told by the newspapers that we do not want to slow down our program, and you are going to have to, of necessity, waste a great deal of money when you take a large group of women in because you lose them through marriage. I find this stunning.
Why? Why had Jacqueline Cochran done this? She had basically knocked down the Women in Space program. How she stomached it then, I don't know.
The most shocking thing about the hearings was that we felt like Jackie turned against us. Janie and Jerry counted on Jackie Cochran supporting them, and Jackie Cochran did not do what they thought she was going to do.
Was a shock, yeah.
Yeah, it was much of a shock.
Jacqueline Cochran now she had always worked with the military. And so Jackie was convinced by the brass, by these generals, if she tried to push this now, that it was going to have a bad effect on the program. In fact, it might even stop the program. Well, I think that's ludicrous, but she bought in.
And they took my testimony, I sent it around, and got what I was going to say approved by the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, the Chief of Naval Operations, and the Army, and with a little note and said, this is what I'm going to say, but if you don't agree with it, I'll try to avoid testifying and I won't say anything.
Jackie Cochran was not a feminist. In my mind, the definition of a feminist is someone who really champions and promotes women. Jackie was a champion of Jackie.
I think if Jackie had been one of the 13 in that program, her entire demeanor, her entire testimony, and everything that she said in that hearing would have been very different.
any number of ways to keep them from achieving what they wanted to achieve.
I think it had as much to do with the boys not wanting to have the light taken away from them because they were the heroes of our time.
One beautiful woman as an astronaut would have just dominated the news to the extent that the other 7 would feel, oh, what has gone wrong and where's my money?
If the gentlemen who denied the Mercury 13 were comfortable in their skin, they would have behaved differently. But underneath it all, it's just some little boy who's afraid.
We all know why it didn't happen. And that goes back to this issue of just prejudice, good old-fashioned prejudice.
Of course they were prejudiced.
It was a good old boy network, and there was no such thing as a good old girl network.
I was disappointed because I knew I did it well, but they didn't like that, or they didn't like any of the people doing it, so that was the end of that one.
Years later, Jackie admitted to me she was embarrassed, she was regretful, and somewhat ashamed, and told.
In order to beat the Russians to the moon, we first have to catch up with them. When do you think this might happen, and what do you expect their next space mission to be?
A little difficult to pinpoint where we stand in a race when the opposition does everything under cloak and dagger type secrecy, where we don't know what they're doing. You don't know what you're racing against, really.
You don't have any idea what their next mission might be. There's supposed to be one close.
No, none at all. I have no secret information other than what I read in the newspapers.
Valentina, although she was Russian and we wish the first one would have been American, she still helped the program.
It was a bold move to climb into one of those vehicles and shoot up into space and then see what happens next. Valentina was a sport parachutist. We would rather have seen a pilot selected. But the fact that they had a woman going into space, that was a breakthrough. And we admired her very much.
The Russians would put up a woman cosmonaut. Is there any room in our space program for a woman astronaut, in your opinion, sir?
Well, we could have used a woman on the second, the second orbital Mercury Atlas that we had. We could have put a woman up of the same type of woman and flown her instead of the chimpanzee. Now,
Mother was really angry, yeah. Yes, she was, and stayed that way, actually. This termination of this program began to move her in the direction of being radicalized. Mother was one of the very first founding members of NOW, the National Organization of Women. She'd been invited.
You've only got 15 minutes before we want you driving back to the LEM. Over.
Okay. We'll get to work. Sarah, we need to sample here.
Going to the moon was one of those points in the 60s where there was something we could all share with pride.
It's a great ride. Steering's a little tricky, though. Ooh.
But imagine how much more telling and significant it would have been to have a woman step onto the moon.
It was a very seriously missed opportunity. This really could have changed lives hugely, not just in terms of, little girls getting engineering degrees, but moving into positions of real power, implementing practices and policies that might have represented that humanitarian component of woman, as opposed to the bellicose boys.
It would have had an amazing positive impact, empowering women in general and overcoming this notion that women cannot do what men do in this country.
I would have liked to have walked on the moon. I would have loved to have put the American flag into the crust of the moon and saluted it. Pick up a few rocks, and boy, those rocks are worth a lot today. And do the assignments that had to be done. I would have loved it. I could have walked on it. I could have kicked it out. I could have made dust. Because I know the guys did. I could have done anything they did.
I grew up in Elmira, New York, and the interesting thing about Elmira is it's the location of the National Soaring Museum. So when I was a child, I'd watch the gliders take off and land, and I wondered what would it be like if I was up there. So I started thinking as a child that maybe I could fly someday. As I got older, I decided I wanted to be an astronaut. But I don't remember thinking, I can't do this because I'm not a man. It was more like, well, I'm going to be an astronaut, and I'll just be a woman astronaut. The Air Force opened flight training to women in 1976. I was in the first class of women pilots in the Air Force that went right out of college, and we were in a test program. So we just knew if we had failed, then women wouldn't continue to fly. So I tried very, very hard. I wasn't going to date anybody. I wasn't going to have a crazy social life because it was so important to me to be the best pilot I could be. I came back to the squadron, and there was a yellow note hanging on the bulletin board, and it said, "Call NASA." I go, this is it. They're going to tell me if I'm in or out. John Young answered the phone. He was an astronaut who walked on the moon during the Apollo program. The first thing he said to me was, "Do you still want to be an astronaut?" I said, yes. So he went through this whole long narrative about what I was going to do at Johnson Space Center, and then he said, "Do you have any questions?" I said, "Yes. Am I going to be a pilot or a mission specialist?" And he said, "You're going to be a pilot. You're going to be the first woman to pilot the space shuttle."
Mr. President, Mrs. Clinton, and Administrator Golden, I just can't tell you how much of an honor it is for me to be here today. I also think it's important that I point out that I didn't get here alone. There's so many women throughout this century that have gone before me and have taken to the skies. From the first barnstormers through the women Air Force, the women military Air Force service pilots from World War II, the Mercury women from back in the early 1960s that went through all the tough medical testing. All these women have been my role models and my inspiration, and I couldn't be here today without them, and I'd like to say a special thank you to them.
The Mercury 13 women are heroes of mine. We all had this bond because we're all pilots. So I invited all of them to my launch. Well, when NASA found out what was going on and who these women were, NASA took them off of my list and put them on the VIP list.
Eileen Collins went up. I got a call, and she invited me to come to the launch.
They had a press conference or whatever where they had the astronauts up on the stage in this large hall. They had Eileen take the microphone before she did anything else. She said, "I would like to recognize the Mercury 13.
Very gracious and outgoing to us and could not have been nicer. But I will never forget that when all those astronauts stood up and clapped for us.
We have booster ignition and liftoff of Columbia, reaching new heights for women in X-ray astronomy.
Columbia is in a roll. We've got a fuel cell PH number 1.
Roger, roll, Columbia. We're looking at
People thinking that, yes, women can do this.
And Houston, what you're seeing is the actual movement of deploy there when we take the switch to deploy, and it's so quiet. And we're just amazed.
When I talk about the future of space exploration, one of the things I tell young people nowadays is, of the 12 people that walked on the moon, they were all men. But that was a function of the culture that we had in the world back in the 1960s. You can be the first woman to walk on the moon if you want to be an astronaut. That's the message I tell young people. Maybe the first person to walk on Mars will be a woman.
We got Eileen. We got all the girls. A lot of them were engineers. Some were pilots.
you.